Welcome back to On the Clock, our show about making the moments matter. I'm your host, Elisa Gums. For the next few episodes, we'll be doing a special series in the lead up to this very important election, all about how it's affecting Black women. Today, we're chatting about the election anxiety so many of us are feeling. And joining us is Dr. Chinwé Williams, a speaker, author, trauma therapist, and the founder of Meaningful Solutions Counseling and Consulting. Dr. Chinwé, we're so excited to have you here on the Clock. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me, Elisa.
Of course. Before we get into our very timely topic, I'd love to hear some of your background story. How was it that you were called to become a therapist?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, I don't know if you could tell, or maybe your listeners can tell, that my name is not typical. My first name is Chinwé, which is of Nigerian origin. It's actually Igbo, which is our native language, and it means God's gift. So I was born in Nigeria, came to the States when I was 3 years old. My parents are educators. I have family members that are that represent so many different industries. And I remember coming to my parents in high school. I had taken a psychology course, and I told my parents that I wanted to be a helper in this way. I don't even know if I said psychologist, but I was like, wow, this is really interesting what I'm learning. And I remember my dad, who was a French professor at the time, now retired, said, "Come again?" And he said, "Is that similar to being an engineer?" And I said, "No." He said, "Is that similar to being a medical doctor?" I said, "Well, kind of no." So Elisa, there is no word. This is what I discovered from my parents. There's no word for therapist in the Igbo language. Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
So my parents, not that there aren't helpers, but that concept, now it's changing, it's changed. However, at that time, my parents were scratching sort of their heads like, "Come again? I don't quite understand." But what I knew at that time was that I enjoyed listening to people when people talked about their pain or their struggles or their discomfort. I felt no discomfort. I did not feel that feeling that sometimes we get, like, "Oh, I just want to get out of this conversation." And from what I learned from my friends later on, I was a pretty good vault, right? So I was a good secret keeper. So I just looked into more about what that meant to help people with various forms of emotional and mental health struggles. So it just became clearer and clearer to me as I kind of matriculated through high school and then decided to major in psychology at the undergraduate level, and then went on to pursue my master's and doctorate degrees.
And I have to say that your voice is so soothing. Like, we've only been talking a few minutes. And I'm like, I love listening to you already. So I can totally understand how, people want to come and talk to you and listen to what you have to say back. But what does it mean that you specialize in trauma?
Yes, 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 yes. So that came a little bit later. Initially in my career, I focused on general wellness. I worked a lot with adolescents. I worked a lot with families. It was later in my career, in my doctorate degree, where I did an internship at a psychiatric hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm based out of Roswell, Georgia, which is a suburb approximately 27 miles north of the Atlanta airport. So I did my schooling at Georgia State University, my doctorate degree, and there was a hospital that wasn't far where I did my internship, and I saw a lot of what we call trauma. So my definition of trauma, if you look it up, you'll see many different variations, but my definition of trauma is any experience, not an event, because it's not necessarily the case that one event will register as traumatic for every single person. You and I, for example, can go through, God forbid, a house fire, and we're neighbors because, that's going to happen if our homes are that close, and both of our homes burn down to the ground, and you come out of it saying, well, no one got hurt. These are things. Things can always be replaced. Let's try to move forward and pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, I am devastated. No one got hurt, but I can't get out of bed. So trauma registers differently because of someone's past experience, sometimes the way that they've been socialized, if they've experienced a trauma in their past. So trauma affects people differently. So my definition of trauma is this: any experience, not an event, that overwhelms your nervous system's capacity to cope. So what that means is we are all gifted, blessed, created with different coping skills that we've developed over time, traits that we have, predispositions, temperaments, God-given talents. When something happens that overwhelms our ability to cope with it, then our body has registered it as a trauma. So if I normally can go for a run and manage, or go talk to my friends and manage, or pray and meditate, but then something happens like COVID, which is what we heard from a lot of our clients for those 3 years where COVID was really active, my normal coping strategies are no longer serving me. So that then I'm looking at that as a traumatic event or a traumatic experience.
Oh, and I love that you tie it back to the biological. So many times people think that, it's sort of like all in our heads and, you just have to like push past it. And you're like, no, there's some real things going on here as your body is registering it. Much like the pandemic, we are in the midst of some very maybe exciting, maybe confusing, definitely anxiety producing times. We're literally counting down to the election now. The news coverage is nonstop. Everywhere you go, people want to talk about it. And for some of us, that can feel overwhelming. My first question for you is, how can we deal with that overload?
Oh my goodness. And you know what? It's so interesting. Lisa, I've been talking about, so I do a racial trauma seminar probably at least once a month. I have other specialty areas, but that's been coming up. There's been a request for people to really understand the nature and the impact of trauma since COVID. And then racial trauma, as we know, we experienced a double pandemic, those of us who are members of the Black community, because of the acute impact and the effects of COVID on our community specifically. And there was a lot of loss, a lot of disenfranchised grief. So I've been talking about racialized stress and trauma consistently over the past 3.5 years, but even more so, these conversations are coming up with a lot of energy just in the past 10 days. I don't even know. Maybe it's been like 4 days, but it feels like 2 weeks, right? Since we now know that the Democratic nominee for president is Vice President Kamala Harris. And so there has been a lot of emotions, a lot of mixed emotions, contradictory emotions that, I talk about trauma. It may not be a trauma, probably isn't, but because of the compounded history of collective pain and trauma experienced by Black people, people of color, yes, Black people is usually what I focus on in my courses. This just hits differently. So yes, there's excitement, there's energy, there's exuberance, right? And then some people are bracing, and that's a very interesting sort of description that many of us in the trauma field use, because that really does speak to so many people's experience. Lisa, in psychology, we talk about anticipatory anxiety. So that's the anxiety that many people feel, people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, when they are anticipating that something bad will happen. And this is a terrible thing to feel. It's almost like a sustained vigilance, like your body is in fight or flight constantly, which it actually cannot be. Our body can't sustain that nervous system state for that long. However, it feels so distressful, even if it's like 10 minutes of that. So I'm hearing, and literally right before I jumped on, I met with a Black female professional. We've not met with each other probably for 6 months because she's been doing fantastic. She scheduled something with me a month ago, and then, with the news hit the media. So she was actually going to talk to me about something else. This took up probably the majority of our session just a little bit ago, where there's this mixed feeling of elation and excitement and people really understanding the historic significance of the moment, regardless, and this is really important to share with your listeners, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of political leanings. Many Black women are both excited and also petrified, bracing for what is to come and what you and I know it has already come.
Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned that our bodies can't sustain that fight or flight response. And this election is bringing up a lot of anxiety in a lot of people. What are some tips or tools that you can share with us to help calm us down so that we're not constantly in that elevated state?
100%, 100%. So I want to share with you also that there is a term called racial microaggressions that many of your listeners are probably really, really familiar with. But that's usually what's going to register as a uh-oh to our nervous system. And that's going to cause that heightened state of vigilance or bracing, or sometimes sadness and anxiety and guilt and anger. And for many people who've experienced this before, and we saw this with the murder of George Floyd, my goodness, Sonia Massey not too long ago, and so many different examples. Sometimes there's even rage. So we do need to calm. So I love your question. We do need to find ways of calm, because it's not just going to be the overt, in your face language or racial slurs that are going to be thrown and absorbed by people of color, Black women specifically, and it's going to be couched as criticism, right? But it feels like an attack when they're going after the vice president, not on issues, not on qualifications, not on her record, but on her personally. So that is a microaggression when they do not pronounce her name correctly. You and I, just before we jumped on here, you said, how do you pronounce your name? I want to make sure I get that right. People don't realize how honoring that is, especially for communities of color, because our names are so important for many people. I'm not going to say everyone. Some of our names are connected to our ancestors. Some of our names have spiritual associations. So it's not always going to be the overt. It's going to be the subtle things, like not pronouncing her name. And this is a woman who has been second in command in our nation for how long now? So what do we do to experience calm? Well, there's so many different techniques and strategies I just want to share with everyone. Some of it is going to be very election specific. In this season, how do we survive the next 100 days? But a lot of these things that I'm going to share with you are just wellness tips that are going to be really, really useful for your nervous system, for your mind, for your body, because trauma, stress, over time, chronic stress impacts both. So the first thing is to recognize that self-care is not a four-letter word. Many of us are familiar with the strong Black woman stereotype or schema that's really about managing beyond our capacity, right? And pushing through, having emotional restraint, right? Not appearing as weak, and also taking responsibility for everyone's problems and issues, and sometimes treating them as they were our own. Sometimes I say this to my Black female clients, and they're like, "Woo, I feel that," and I'm like, "Yeah, I do too. I do too." It's a double-edged sword because it can be helpful. It can help us, forge on and cope, but it could also be very pressuring. It could also be very self-sacrificing. So we have to understand that self-care is not an indulgence. It's not what the marketing executives have shoved down our throat. It's not spa days and getting our nails done and long bubble baths. Now, don't get me wrong, it could be. And if you gave me that as a gift, I'm not going to turn it down. But those are really sort of, temporary. It feels good. I do recommend it to my clients. But healing from trauma, if that is what any of your listeners are experiencing, must occur both on a societal level and an individual level. Now, we do not have time in the next 100 days for society to say, no, we do not talk to Black women like that. We do honor accomplishments. We all have self-worth. If we held our breath, we wouldn't be here, right? So we have to do what's within our control to take care of ourselves. So understanding that your humanity matters and that we can't take care of others if we're not taking care of ourselves. So the first tip, which is easy breezy, is to consider just taking a break from social media. I call it a social media detox with many of my clients. Elisa, we have this thing where, I don't know if you would agree with this, where we feel like we have to stay informed, right? Especially when bad things happen to members of our community, when the world seems to be falling apart. And in this election, which feels so consequential, I have this thing where I'm just like, I've got to stay on top of all the latest developments. Breaking news. What's Wolf Blitzer saying today? You know what I mean? And certainly during the pandemic, because so much was changing, I had to turn that off, and I encourage my clients to do the same. We do not have to read every breaking alert, because what it does is that it actually heightens our stress alarm system, our fight and flight alarm system, which keeps us in a defensive state. It's not helpful. We think that it's helping us to prepare better. If that were the case, then yes, like some things like NPR, I recommend to my clients, get your news in small bites, get your news from news anchors that have like calm voices. I get my news from on social media not social media, from my phone technology every little bit. So I'm not staying up late watching nightly news, which can be really alarming. And social media is really supposed to be used for socializing. Let's go back to that, especially during this election cycle, because there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. And there's a lot that if we look at it while we're at work, if we look at it while we're making dinner for our family, it can really put us on high alert. So that's an easy one. I say easy, probably not for everyone, but that's one. And then the other thing is, if you are in a work setting or in a social environment where this is on the news, or people are talking about it, and you feel like you can't get up from the dinner and walk away, or you're in an office environment and you're just constantly exposed. Maybe people aren't saying anything racist or triggering, but you're just exposed to it. Do something for yourself that helps to reset your brain. And there are a number of things that you can do to renew your mind, even in that moment. You can walk away, even just 10 minutes of sunshine, getting some vitamin D, or just being out in nature can be really helpful. You can go sit in your car, or maybe you have that dinner, you get through the dinner, and then you're on your way home. Instead of sort of thinking about or ruminating around what they talked about and what you may have disagreed with, or what felt like a low-key racial microaggression, turn the music on. Turn the music up and sing. Believe it or not, loud singing or loud chanting can help reset what we call the vagus nerve, but I don't want to get into that. But your nervous system, again, taking brisk walks in nature, it doesn't have to be long, or just standing there and getting a little bit of vitamin D, and then also just breathing. Many trauma therapists, really any mental health professional, will tell you that breathing is actually the quickest and most effective way of resetting your nervous system. It helps to click on the analytical part of your brain and then click off the emotional, reactive part of your brain.
Yeah.
So those are just a few, and I can keep going, or if you have, I just feel like I've been kind of talking and talking.
Well, I mean, you've been giving out some good stuff. So I wanted, to make sure that we got through all that. And we're going to come back to the attacks
Yeah.
on our Vice President Kamala, as her name is pronounced. And we all know that Harris later, because I know you have some very important points to talk about with that. But as you were talking about sort of the range of emotions that we're
Yeah.
all feeling, it's not one thing. Oftentimes it's contradictory emotions. I was thinking about one that doesn't, people aren't talking about so much with this election, but I think is important, which is like avoidance. I was having a
Mm.
conversation with my cousin recently, and we were just going through and remembering some of the completely like outrageous things that happened during the Trump presidency. And she said to me, I'm tired of living through unprecedented times. And that
Mm.
like really hit for me. And I was thinking, there are so many of us who are just feeling like, and especially before Kamala entered the race, that we just want to throw our hands up and like be done with the entire political process. How can we
Mhm.
work through those feelings of avoidance?
Oh, that's so good. And so, what people, I love that you're bringing this up, because what people don't often realize is that numbness is a feeling. you can you can actually feel numb, and as we talked about just a little bit ago, our nervous system cannot sustain a state of constant hypervigilance. So then what's on the other side, right? It swings from, oh, I have to watch every single coverage. I have to attend to the breaking news. I have to be a part of every conversation. I have to offer people my points, or even fight with family members who have, different views, to I'm exhausted. And so you move to the other side, where you can shut down, which is another nervous system response to high stress or trauma. So for anyone that's listening and they feel the exact same way as your family member or friend, I just want them to know that that's normal. And everybody's going to react to these chaotic, wild, unprecedented times differently. And so, what I say to that is, that's not going to be forever either, but just recognize, and this is going to sound, I don't know how this is going to be received, but I hope your listeners hear this in the best way, because I want to be direct, but I also want to offer a lot of love and compassion. This is what I say to my clients. When we numb out pain, the sad reality is that we can also numb out joy. We can numb out love. When we are in that hypo aroused state of defeat, disillusionment, discouragement, my clients use the words despair. So it's not just avoiding. Maybe that's the case for your family member, but I have clients, because they're coming in for therapy, where they're just shut down. And that's what I remind them of, right? Is you want to find those moments, however fleeting, of joy. You want to connect with the people that lift you up, that see your worth. You don't have to explain your worth. You don't have to explain how to pronounce your name for the third time. They just know, they want to know. We call it glimmers in trauma therapy. What are those glimmers? What are those things that lift you up? Because avoidance, and then over time, that discouragement, and then that, throwing up the hands, can be really difficult. But what it's really speaking to is, I don't know what to do. What can I do? I feel completely out of control. And that's a form of anxiety that can lead into depression, right? Uncertainty of where the world is going to be, how we're going to come back together as a nation, because we feel so divided. Family members are disagreeing, and it can feel really toxic. So what I share with my clients, and what I want to share with your viewers, your listeners, is focus on what you can do, right? There's so much that's out there, and we can expend our energy in the fight. And if you have energy to volunteer, to engage in a book club, to mobilize, to coalesce, to battle people on social media, have at it. But for other people, you actually don't have to expend your energy in that way if you don't have it. Rest for a bit, take care of yourself, find your anchors, your glimmers, those things that help you regain a sense of balance, and come back in the fight. Right. And even if it's just being with family, right? You don't even have to share political views, but that's always the risk that I just want to share, is that if we stay in that place of avoidance too long, we can completely numb out the good stuff.
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned some of the attacks. People are dissecting every aspect of Vice President Harris, from her physical appearance to her laugh to her intellect. Please explain how those attacks can be psychologically damaging to the rest of us as Black women.
Yeah, because of the history of historical, collective, and generational trauma. As you know so well, when the world witnessed the murder of George Floyd, countless numbers of Black women, Black identifying women all over the world reacted. I remember having family members in Africa, in Canada, texting and emailing and being on Zoom calls with people from the Dominican Republic. It was just this collective, like we all felt that. So when there is an attack, of course, that's something that's very extreme, such as police brutality. But even the attacks on Madam Vice President Kamala Harris's, her laugh, her appearance, her intellect, calling her dumb as rocks, saying that she isn't qualified, saying that, she isn't grateful, which is really another way of saying you're so uppity, right? You don't appreciate what's been given to you. You're in America. Why aren't you grateful? Which is ridiculous, that she's a cat lady with no kids and isn't grateful. I mean, there's so many things that we can kind of go tit for tat. And if we were able to sort of just stay intellectual, that's one thing. But far too many of us, we feel it in our gut. And that is because it's a form of re-triggering. It's a form of re-traumatization. Even if you had an experience that really has nothing to do with the political rhetoric or even George Floyd, but maybe something in your childhood or something that happened to your own mom or an experience that your grandmother experienced, that is epigenetics teaches us that that's stored in our DNA, that pain. And so trauma can actually be passed down through stories. It can be passed down through DNA. It can be passed down through the fears that your grandmother had about your safety. So whereas on the surface, it appears that she's, experiencing name calling from the other side, it hurts. Because we know that can even lead to a lack of safety. Not only is it disrespectful, not only is it uncomfortable, not only is it unfair, we as Black people and Black mothers and Black sisters and Black aunties, we know that type of rhetoric can actually lead to death.
Yeah. Is there anything that we can do to sort of protect our psychological safety or overcome that damage when we're feeling it as they're attacking her?
Yeah, very. Oh, I love this question so much. I feel like you've done your research. I feel like you are like a psychology major, are you? I just have to ask.
I'm not. I'm a journalism major, but I will take the compliment.
So you just know your stuff. Oh, 100%. So as you have already acknowledged, trauma impacts us not just cognitively, but physically. And any sort of mental health challenge that we experience has a ripple effect on, every aspect of our lives and the people that love us. So, but back to the nervous system. The nervous system really controls so many aspects of our neurological functioning, including the feeling of safety. So if you are noticing after there's an attack, after someone at work says something that's not based on issues, that's not based on policy, but based on just trying to do psychological harm, notice if you're feeling it in your body. So there is a strategy called grounding that maybe your viewers have heard about. It's gaining popular in the trauma field because of the knowledge that trauma, I'm going to hold up a book, the body remembers. I teach this all the time. The body remembers pain. So we can actually use our body as a source of healing. So I'm a somatic trauma therapist, which means I focus on the body as a way for us to recognize that we're being triggered, but not stay in that state. Also recognize when we need to get back to balance, when we're hyper sort of aroused, when we're like ready, feeling anxious and angry and ready to fight. You don't want to stay there too long, or when we're too low. So I teach my clients how to get back into a sense of balance. So moving your body, the body that we occupy, is a source of fear, but it could also be a source of healing. Get outside, again, stretch. Believe it or not, I've done this with my Black female clients. They did. In fact, several of them rolled their eyes when I told them to do this, but they reported that it was really helpful, especially the biggest cynic. Get outside, take your shoes off, and place your feet on the grass. And do sort of like an assessment when you're feeling upset. And this actually works with any sort of, psychological harm, maybe from a partner, fighting with your teenage daughter, a work-related situation. Notice how you feel in your body. Do an assessment, 0 to 10. How rough does this feel? How much tension, discomfort, restriction, constriction? Are you feeling hot? Are you feeling, mobilized to just walk out or to hit something? Give it a number. 10 is the highest. 8. Okay. Now notice your body. If you're able to get outside, get outside. If you're able to take your shoes off, you're, able to do that. And just stay there for just a couple of minutes and just take a couple of deep breaths and notice that. And by the way, sometimes there are rainy days. Sometimes that feels weird. You don't want to do that. You can do it sitting at your desk. Just notice your bottom touching the seat cushion of your chair. If you're standing, many of us have standing workstations. Notice the balls of your feet touching either your socks or your shoes, or if you're working from home and you have no shoes on, notice your feet pressing down against the wood floor or the carpet or the rug. Notice that you're being held up. Attend to your body, even stretch from one side to the other. There's something called shake therapy. Just shake it off or turn on some music and dance really vigorously. We know that high intensity workouts, many people are familiar with that. They're interval training workouts that are short and really efficient, because what it's doing is that it's incorporating that mindfulness, noticing your body, but also like doing something kind of quickly and aggressively. But you don't have to be aggressive. You can just take a simple walk. So that's probably my number one thing in the moment when you can't, go get your sister circle or go to your place of worship. Those things work as well when you can't get access to a friend to tell them what you're going through and to receive encouragement. Just pause, notice your breath, notice your body, give yourself a moment, and just check in to see if that made a difference.
Well, even this conversation has been so calming and so reassuring. Thank you, Dr. Chinwé, for sharing the unique ways you're helping us make the most of the time we've been given by helping us stay calm and be well during these anxious days. And thank you all for watching On the Clock. We'll see you next time as we continue to talk about working with purpose and living with passion.